Since this is the Joseph Gerasi lecture moment, the picture that's being taken is of Judge Gerasi and our, of course, Pulitzer Prize winning author. Heather, thank you. That was unbelievable setup. What a book. And here is the book. And it's a page turner. I must tell you, when I picked it up to read in anticipation of this, you're intimidated, frankly, by the size. I agree. You're looking at that and you say, oh my God, let's get to the executive summary. So I read Lee Coppola's review of it, which was marvelous. Then I started reading it from page 1, page 2, page 100, 200, 300, and about 2 days it was done. And my wife said, what's wrong with you? I said, what's wrong is Heather Ann Thompson, her ability to write. It is an incredible narrative, and of course has a lot of legal stuff as well to it. And I commend to you, by the way, the booklet that was prepared for the CLE has articles by Dr. Thompson, has some articles by Robert Jackson, has articles by a gentleman by the name of Sam Williams dealing with the litigation aspects of it, the legal issues arising out of the Attica prison uprising, some more detail on Judge Teleska and how he really acted as Solomon in trying to orchestrate the settlements, which is described in great detail in the book, but also described in the memo itself. This part of it is a panel. It's a panel which is entitled Attica Legal Perspectives and Legacy, and it's star-studded. Dr. Thompson, who we introduced a little bit earlier, will be joining with Lee Coppola. Lee Coppola has a resume a mile long. He's the Mike Wallace of the Buffalo area, so when Lee Coppola knocked on your door, you did cringe. For years, he was an investigative reporter for the Buffalo Evening News and various television channels, WKBW's Eyewitness News, so when you saw Lee Coppola, you go, oy, boy, somebody's in trouble. And he worked very closely, and then he's an attorney. He was an associate U.S. attorney in Buffalo. He also then went on to become the dean of the Journalism and Mass Communications School at St. Bonaventure, a real legend, but also was there day one at Attica. Joining Lee is Gary Loford, and we're thrilled to have Gary. He's the FBI special agent in charge of the Buffalo field office. That means he's the #1 guy. And we're thrilled. He's a Newfane, New York native, having found his way through Miami, Jacksonville, Dallas, a variety of locations to come back to his native Western New York. And so we're thrilled, Gary, you could join us and be part of this panel and to give us a little the FBI perspective. And if anybody wants to fess up today, that you're on your own. There is a couple of other sidebar things here, which I love these events for many, many reasons, because you never know who's in the audience. One is Herb Siegel of fame as a lawyer in the Buffalo area, Siegel, Keller, and Kahn, right? And Herb was just telling me that in his early days, he worked in the Ellicott building, and he was a chauffeur at least one time for William Kunstler. So as he's making sure that Kunstler can sign autographs and get the photo ops, the guy who made that all happen was Herb Siegel, so Herb takes complete credit for that. And Mary Labruzzetta, who's the courtroom deputy clerk for Justice Scrutiny in the federal court, she's here, Mary, there, over there. She's hiding now because Lee tipped her off as to what I was hoping to accomplish. Her uncle was a hostage. So as Heather Ann Thompson was talking about hostages, hostage treatment, the uncle who did survive. So if maybe time permits, even though you're secreted back in the middle of the pack, we may ask you to come forward and share a comment or two. I know you're reluctant to do that, but that doesn't mean we won't ask.
was sentenced to Attica for a robbery in 1966. Attica was a nightmare. Conditions, overcrowded. From the moment I got there, I was conscious of the racial prejudice. The guards, they were vicious. They had no qualms about calling you nigger. The prison ran on anger. It ran on fright. We heard that a prisoner was killed by guards in another prison. Everybody felt like if they did it to this guy, they can do it to anybody. It wasn't planned, it was spontaneous. I came out of the shower and everything was different. I'm naked, I'm soaking wet, I'm looking around, a riot had erupted, people are crazy, and I got crazy with them. It was just total chaos, you know? It was nobody in control.
You can make out the Molotov cocktails sitting on the ramp between the two chairs in this barricade.
We seen some guards from the metal shop that was taken hostage. Some of them got beat up.
We urgently demand immediate negotiations.
Over a course of about 2 or 3 days, we tried to negotiate with the authorities, but it was all a game. It wasn't really a negotiation. It was like make-believe. Things changed. It became more serious.
10:05 a.m. September 13th. We're on the roof of A block, waiting for the assault to begin. The hostages are on the catwalks with knives at their throats.
When they stormed the prison, you know, they came in dropping gas and shooting guns. I remember guys getting shot to pieces. I seen a guy, they took his head off and blood was pouring out of the stem where his neck was. I thought I was gonna die. I had nightmares like you wouldn't believe. Scared to go to sleep. And this went on for years. It was a very defining moment in my life. It changed me because I realized how precious life is.
I also should point out that in our midst and among the members of the Jamestown Bar Association is Paul Webb Jr. Paul brought up an identification card that, in fact, he was an investigator, young investigator for that was the McKay Commission. McKay Commission, and there's the card. So Paul is another story in our midst, and we thank you. Now, to my left is Lee Coppola. Lee Coppola on September 13th, 1971, had a byline on the Buffalo Evening News, and the headlines read, 9 hostages, 28 prisoners die in an all-out Attica attack. Many others wounded as state police guards storm prison to crush riot, by Lee Coppola, Ray Hill, and Paul McLennan. So Lee, you were there, September 13th, 1971, when things started happening. First of all, give me a little backstory of how you even got that assignment and what you were doing at that time.
Well, at that time at the Buffalo Evening News, I was working on the rewrite desk, which is the guy who takes in the information from reporters in the field and puts together the story for the paper. On Thursday of that week, September the 9th, Attica, of course, was taken over by the prisoners. And the news assigned our rural reporter, a guy by the name of Bob Byer, to cover the Attica uprising, while other reporters stayed in the office and gathered information from Bob and called our sources and tried to put together stories. Now, as you saw, the media was allowed inside Attica. So from Thursday and Friday and Saturday and Sunday, I was this young 27-year-old eager reporter wanting to get my hands on this major story, because we were watching reporters come in from all over, literally all over the world. And of course, with cameras inside the prison, we were watching what was happening inside the prison. But, you know, we had reporters on the scene, namely Bob Byer and Paul McLennan, so I had to stay in the office. And of course, I was off on Saturday and Sunday, and I walked into the office on Monday, September 13th, and I can tell you it was a dreary and rainy day. I had the day shift at the news, so it started at 7 o'clock in the morning. And the minute I walked in the office, my editor, Bud Wacker, looked at me and he said, something's going to happen to Attica, get out there. Well, I was thrilled. I was going to be covering Attica, and I said, where's Attica? And he told me, just keep driving out Genesee Street. And so I kept driving out Genesee Street, and I found Attica, obviously. And when I got there, the troopers and the correction officers and the sheriff's deputies, the county sheriff's deputies, were all massed outside the main gate. And then I could see them as I got there, probably around 9 o'clock, 9:15, started going in the main door, all of them heavily armed with rifles and shotguns. One of the things that I found interesting about Heather's book is that a lot of correction officers brought their own guns, I mean from home, that no one could ever trace. So they brought their own weapons inside the prison. And I watched them go in, and then all of a sudden, the helicopter appeared overhead and started yelling at the prisoners, release the hostages, lay down your arms, and then the tear gas came. And I can tell you, as a reporter with the probably 100 other reporters outside, as that tear gas wafted over the walls, we started hearing these shots. Pow, 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 pow. Gatling gun effect of all these shots. And as it came over the wall, you know, the tears started coming down my face. And to this day, I don't know if I was crying because of the tear gas or because I could envision what was happening inside, because I knew none of the prisoners had weapons of mass destruction. None of them had arms. And I saw all these troopers and correction officers and sheriff's deputies walking into the prison heavily armed. So I knew it was kind of like shooting ducks in a pond. And it was an atrocious thing, the firing happened probably for 10 or 15 minutes, and then it stopped. All right, we're all the media outside wanting to know what's going on, what happened. And finally, after about an hour and a half, the spokesman for the corrections department comes outside by the name of a man by the name of Jerry Houlihan, and he gets up on a little platform, and we're all crowded around him, and he tells us what Heather told you before. Oh, 9 of the hostages, their throats were slit. They were killed by the prisoners, and then one was eviscerated, and his genitals were stuck in his mouth. And of course, we're journalists. We're sitting out there. We have no way to confirm this. We have no way to back it up. We have to listen to officialdom. So we were all taking notes, scribbling furiously, and trying to put together the facts as we saw them of that day. And of course, we didn't know until the next day when the coroner in Monroe County examined the bodies and came out publicly to say none of their throats were slit. My editor came to me and he said, where did you get that information about their throats were slit? And I said, well, I attributed in my story to Houlihan, who told us that outside the prison. So it was a very traumatic journalistic experience for me because it was the most major story up until that time that I had ever covered. And then to be waylaid by the state, to be told something that was so factually incorrect, it was absurd, really irritated me as a journalist. So, you know, the fury of being a reporter to try and get it right, and then the anger of being told something that wasn't correct was all part of my, I guess, journalistic upbringing. And so Attica means a lot to me from that standpoint.
So the headlines scream on this September 13th, 1971, Rocky blames militant inmates for deaths at Attica. Governor blames rioters' rejection of peace officer. Seal, Bobby Seale, blames deaths on Oswald. And resisting inmates killed on the spot. How did you find, as this was rolling out, Lee, and you were part of a byline on September 13th, and as the days progressed, did you have a chance to sort of revisit the story? Did you actually?
Well, we corrected the story that we had written that day, obviously, when we found out that the coroner was attributing the cause of death to gunshot wounds and not throats being slit. So we in a way, didn't correct it. We just reported what factually took place. And that, in effect, corrected the incorrect facts that were fed to us that day. So we tried to, I guess, journalistically make amends. And one of the, I think it was the Democrat and Chronicle in Rochester, won a Pulitzer Prize for first releasing the fact that the hostages were killed by gunfire and not having their throats slit. So that was a journalistic credit to that newspaper. I wish it had been the Buffalo Evening News, but unfortunately it wasn't.
Gary, you're thrilled that you could join us today, and of course you're kind of wearing the hat of the FBI out of the Buffalo offices. Did you get a sense that even as you're doing some research for today as to kind of the FBI's role in the anticipatory of what was going on in the prison? I know I read in Heather's book some FBI memos and stuff that were...
Can I share that just to set the
Sure,
stage?
absolutely, yeah.
So what was fascinating to me anyway was that, you know, anytime there's a major domestic disturbance, you would expect the FBI to be on the scene in some capacity. But what was stunning to me was that this was a small town in upstate New York, and it's a state prison. It's all very localized, and I discovered that memos were going not just from, you know, FBI agent to FBI agent locally in Buffalo, but they were going all the way up to, and this was what was stunning to me, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, the President, the Vice President, the Attorney General, and that really said to me, wow, the stakes of this are seen as tremendously high, which I had no idea until I had seen those memos. So that was the part that he's referring to.
Did you get a sense, and perhaps, when looking at Maureen, you probably help her and do a little research, well, did any of that sort of disclose itself in your anticipation of today?
So it doesn't surprise me. We still do it to this day. Differently than 1971. Mr. Hoover was still the director. It was his final year. He died in 72.
And John Mitchell was the Attorney General, who was very much interested in those stories.
Absolutely. But anything, yeah, you're right. You know, growing up here, I was 2 years and 364 days old, because my birthday's tomorrow. My 50th birthday's tomorrow. So that's how I know.
Can we sing happy birthday?
No. I said that in jest. So the FBI, obviously, we're not just nationwide, we're international. So we have sources internationally, because we were embedded all over the world. And the intelligence that you can gather on a situation, it would astound you. Somebody in you know, a small town in California having information pertinent to a prison uprising in South Carolina. You mentioned South Carolina earlier. Things like that happen. And it helps inform decision makers. The biggest example when you're talking I could think of was the rioting, the unfortunate rioting that was going on a few years ago.
2016?
In 2016.
Yeah. So another series of prison riots and strikes like right now?
I was talking about Ferguson and Charlotte, North Carolina street rioting.
Yeah, those riots. Yeah. Urban riots.
So what we did, working with our sources across the country. President Obama at the time. He's the decision maker. He's the chief decision maker. We gather intelligence. I think the difference now is, from 1971 to present, we have a lot of intelligence cadre to vet and corroborate intelligence. Now, sometimes we're overwhelmed with information. When something happens, we do our best. Some of it is raw information. By the way, a lot of it is factually incorrect. So when you see a major event and you see the special agent in charge or the chief of police or the sheriff or prison official talking, and now we say, hey, we want to answer your questions, Lee, but we haven't corroborated a lot of this. There's a reason for that. We're not holding back today. It's let's get it right. Let's get it verified. And I think that's the difference from 1971 to today.
Somebody should have told that to Jerry Houlihan.
Yeah.
Do you get a sense, Lee, that the press release had been prepared before the event occurred? It seemed like they came out pretty quickly after the events to report that.
No, I don't even know if they knew what happened. I think they were just surmising that this is what happened, because the picture they had were the hostages being held on the catwalk and the prisoners standing behind them, many of them with knives at the throat of the prisoners. So I think they were just surmising that what happened was that the prisoners, the inmates, actually did slit the throats of the hostages, when in effect, of course, we know that did not happen. And I don't know, based on the amount of tear gas that was in that yard, those sharpshooters, and that's what I have to call them. They were sharpshooters because they were elevated from the yard, and they were shooting down from the administration building into the yard and onto the catwalk. And so they knew what they were shooting, and the vindictiveness of those shooters, the animosity and the anger, both at that time and then following it, as Heather pointed out, was to me humanely atrocious. I mean, these people, no matter what they did, they are human beings, and the way they were treated by government employees was, to me, very atrocious. I mean, that all came out later, obviously, because that day we were believing what the state said. That day we were believing that those throats were slit by the inmates.
Can I just say on that point, because I think that's absolutely right, and in fairness to the media that was there, even today, it is common practice in South Carolina or any number of prison riots. Journalists show up, they ask, who's the source? The source is the Department of Corrections. And in fact, so I think one of the life lessons about the Attica story is don't believe the wolves what happened in the hen house. I mean, in the sense, you don't ask the keepers what happened. I mean, if you had a child that was dead in a home, you wouldn't ask you wouldn't believe what the parents said necessarily, right? You would want to talk to the neighbors. So it's a question of corroboration, but it's logical that you would imagine that state officials who were in charge would know what had happened. And the other piece of it, and this is really to cut everybody a break, is that, if it were the case that all this information were out there just to get, if somebody just would have been dogged enough and determined enough to get it, that would be one thing. But it turns out that there was an active obfuscation going on, and that changes the story. That's not just about a journalist wasn't diving deeply enough. That was literally that what you might have been looking for was no longer there, or had been actively removed, or that the narrative had been changed. And that was the piece of it that had sort of startled me, because to be honest, as a historian, we are constantly cautioning our students. Our students always come in and they've watched these conspiracy theories, about Kennedy and everybody else, and they're always about cover-ups and conspiracies. And as historians, we're always saying, no. Life is not that easy, it's complicated, And so I'm looking at these documents, I'm like, wow. Somebody is literally instructing somebody else to not do X, Y, or Z, or to cover something up. So on the ground, the troopers don't really want to know what's going on. The reporters don't really know what's really going on. And that's why the bulk of the blame in my book, if there is it, if you'll read it, you'll see it's actually with the people who didn't get their hands dirty at all. It was the people who were behind the scenes making these decisions. Because on the ground, you know, God knows. And in defense, the reporters did show up right after they knew that they had been lied to, and they are banging on the door. They were at Rockefeller. Rockefeller would not meet with them. They would show up every single day out of his office and basically, you lied to us, you know, can you explain this? And editors, and I don't know if this has anything to do with the Buffalo Evening News, but I can tell you two quick stories. One is that editors, even when the story was corrected, were very loath to let the reporters then tell the prisoner's side of the story in the papers. And I document this. I mean, these are editors who are saying, you know, well, you could write that, but what we really want you to find out is what were the crimes these guys committed. Let's do a story on the crimes these guys committed. In other words, kind of shifting emphasis off of what had happened. And one reporter, and some of you might have seen the Eyes on the Prize coverage of Attica, what was it, John Johnson, stood outside of Attica, and he's a black reporter, and he's completely overcome when he's hearing these shots, and he just says, cut it off, you know, people are dying in there, and he's like overwhelmed with emotion. And I couldn't find him when I was doing the book, but after the book was out, he contacted me, and he said that he basically lost his job over not wanting to report the lie. That he never believed the lie from the beginning, and when he wouldn't write that headline or story, that he was fired from ABC.
I'm amazed at that, to tell you the truth, because that's the only information journalists had at that time, and not to report it because you didn't believe it. You know, how could I not believe it?
Exactly.
It's coming from a state official who was inside with the people doing it.
And I think it's probably only because, again, this was, 1971. He's a black reporter. This is after Fred Hampton has died. There's a whole lot of stuff that's gone on, which is why he didn't believe it.
Well, we were talking about reporters on the ground, and that brings to mind a vignette of that day that I consider either my lowest point of journalism or my highest point of journalism. There was no cell phones.
Right.
So, and there were probably, as I said, 100 plus reporters, no satellite phones. Ma Bell had set up a bank of maybe 4 or 5 public telephones in front of the prison, but that wasn't enough for us. And I had a paper that was a daily paper, and the deadlines were from, 10:30 in the morning all the way through till 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So I was sent to Attica, and my fellow reporter, Paul McLennan, had already been there. There was a lady who owned a house across the street from Attica, an old lady who was a sweetheart, who let reporters use her phone in the kitchen to phone in their stories. And it was a muddy day, and reporters were all flocked in her dining room, which led to the kitchen. And I felt bad for her because the mud was coming in on the rug, and you had to wait in line to get to the phone. And for professional courtesy, the reporters would all stand back in the dining room so that the reporter who went in the kitchen to use the phone could have some isolation. So I got to be the reporter for the news who went in line and then got to use the phone, and my colleague, Paul McLennan, was at the back of the line waiting for me to finish. I gave my editor all the information I had, and he screamed at me and said, "No, I need to know this right now." And I panicked, and I said, "Oh my God, Paul must know that, but he didn't tell me." So now when I was a kid, and those of you who are older, when I was a kid, I used to unscrew the speaker, the mouthpiece of the phone, and take out the little round thing, the modulator, because my older brother was a pain in the neck, and he was always pushing me off the phone. So I would take the modulator out and screw it back in, and the phone didn't work, of course. So I'm sitting in the kitchen, and I'm thinking, no, I've got to get this information. So I put the phone down by my body, and I unscrewed the mouthpiece. And I took out the modulator, and I put it in my pocket, and I screwed back the mouthpiece. And then I said, "Okay, next." And I put the phone on the hook. And I went outside, and I saw Paul McLennan. And I said, "Paul, blah, 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 blah." And Paul gave me the information. So then I went back into the dining room, and the guy who was on the phone going, "This goddamn phone doesn't work. Son of a bitch, it doesn't work." And I said, "Wait a minute, my father works for the phone company. Maybe I can fix it." So I went in the kitchen, I took out the modulator, unscrewed it, put it back in, and I said, "Let me test it." And I called my editor, I gave him the information, I said, "It's working fine."
my goodness.
Pretty good.
That's such a great.
So
good.
you decide whether that's a low point or a high point.
That's a high point. That's a high
It's
point.
competitiveness. I love it. Fantastic. Just Gary, I think the FBI, some people lose track of the fact that this was a New York State prison. This was not a federal prison at the time. And I was just curious, from just looking at it, what would have been the FBI's jurisdiction, if any, over what went on there? It's sounded like Rockefeller, obviously the governor was involved, everybody else, the New York State Attorney General. But from the FBI's perspective, where do you get jurisdiction?
So back then, it would have been primarily a state matter.
Right.
So they were obviously gathering intelligence, hopefully, for the prevention of loss of life. Obviously, we know that didn't happen. And I'm surmising, obviously surmising. Today, Congress has enacted laws where we could actively participate. In fact, a lot of the lessons learned out of Attica, when I'm talking about our negotiating. We have trained thousands of negotiators, state, local police, corrections officials, and when these situations happen, it's all about the negotiation. It's those negotiators. We consult mental health professionals. We consult behavioral analysis. You know, the profilers at Quantico. They help us to try to get in the mind of the hostage taker, and it's all about a peaceful resolution. And, you know, we've been involved in our own situations. And I remember Louis Freeh, when the Freeman standoff ended, I think it was 81 days out in Idaho. The first thing he said when he did the press conference was, yeah, we've learned from past hostage takings. It was all about the negotiating, and it ended peacefully. And the other thing was, we rotated SWAT teams every 2 weeks. That way, it was a fresh set of SWAT team members. You weren't aggravated after 81 days. It was a fresh perspective. Very expensive to do that, by the way. Well worth the money. It's a peaceful ending. No one died. Can't put a price on a life. So back then, not so sure we had a role other than intelligence gathering for preservation of life, but today it would be much different. We would, our negotiators would undoubtedly be involved.
And my understanding, just to add to that, and that, by the way, that's so interesting. Thank you for sharing that, because I didn't know that. I didn't know about the change in the law. I think the other reason that the FBI was very interested in 1971 was because, again, just to set the context, this is, there'd been so much surveillance on members of the Black Panther Party leading up until that moment, and Bobby Seale was not only asked to come to Attica, but so was, well, Huey Newton was asked to come, Bobby Seale came, and, you know, this is this is 2 years after the major event in Chicago when Fred Hampton was killed, and there was an FBI informant in the house. And so the FBI was very involved in the Black Panther Party, and Nixon believed that there was no real prison crisis, that this was not really about prison conditions. This was about the Black Panther Party and white leftists stirring the pot and making prisoners rebel, basically, that it wasn't legitimate. So there was a national, in his view, there was a national security risk at stake here, which had to do with politics. So the prisoners in that sense, and this prison uprising in that sense, probably had nothing to do with why the FBI was interested in it. It was really, they were interested in the Black Panther Party. And in fact, a lot of those memos that were going back and forth weren't just reporting on Attica up to DC. It was the Oakland office, you know, figuring out what the Black Panthers were doing in Oakland, then communicating with the Buffalo office, and actually, like, I could see some of the memos, like Bobby Seale got on the plane at 10 o'clock in the morning, you know, he's headed to Attica, or all the cars that were coming off the freeway at Batavia, like, you know, are any of them Black Panthers? So I think that was really the interest, was the Black Panther Party.
So I'll say this, that's over 110-year history. We've had our blemishes, and that's the COINTEL program back then, no doubt about it. I'll just say it to save you from saying it. The point I'm making is agents today will say, in these national security cases, some of these people we suspect are really doing harm to our country. They say, why do I have to do this 100-page affidavit to get this, to do this technique? And I'll say, Read about COINTELPRO and you'll know why the FISA Act of 1978 was established.
Yeah.
But I believe in a check on power.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you were alluding to earlier. Power needs to be checked constantly. And I think this is a prime example of power was not checked.
Right, that's right.
Aside from the Black Panthers, there was a kind of a interesting menagerie of people who was interested in the Attica. Some of them had their own stakeholding access to it. For the Muslims, for example, Elijah Muhammad, you had his surrogate, I'm just drawing a blank.
Well, he wouldn't come.
Yeah.
They
Elijah
wanted
Muhammad
him.
would not come, and then they were going to send.
They wanted Farrakhan to come,
Farrakhan.
and he wouldn't come. So a lot of people were just like, I don't know, this is not going to end well. I don't want to give my yay or nay either way.
Did you get a sense, even like as Herb Siegel's taking William Kunstler there to sign autographs? I mean, he's a celebrity. He's a celebrity attorney at the time. I recognize human rights, but was there some of that, a little bit of grandstanding as well?
Well, I think there was lots of grandstanding on everyone's part at Attica, no question about that. But I actually think that I never had the pleasure of meeting a lot of these folks, like Bill Kunstler, because he had already passed away when I was doing the book. I did interview, for example, Tom Wicker, and he died right before my book came out, which actually broke my heart because he was still, the day when I interviewed him, he just still sobbed. I mean, he felt so much guilt for not having been able to stop this, and I wish he would have seen the book because he would have understood that he could not have stopped it. But anyway, I digress. So Kunstler got a lot of flack. The idea was that he had stirred the pot, and weren't trying to get the prisoners to actually settle, and that he had made things worse. And I looked at that record very, very carefully, and that is not my assessment. I think that yes, he was a celebrity, and yes, he knew he was a lightning rod for controversy, but I think he was very much trying to tell the men inside the truth about what was happening. I think he was devastated by what happened, but where his grandstanding, I think, maybe came into it was later. It was during the trial. He represented two of the Attica defendants. And one of them was defended by Ramsey Clark, former Attorney General. One of them was represented by Bill Kunstler, and their styles were very, very different. And Bill Kunstler was much more combative with the judge. And I think it's fair to say that cost him. I mean, that kind of bombacity cost him in that trial.
One of the interesting parts of your book is, in fact, the lawyer's part of the book.
Which is a huge part of it, all you lawyers. It's the whole middle.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and you got, as she appropriately said, the first third is the actual what happened, what was shown in the movie, and et cetera, and that's great history. And Lee lived that part of the history. And then you got these young lawyers who take a roll of the dice, and whether it's in the criminal defense world, and there's a couple of individuals who stand out. And certainly the defense part, because of you're showing a one-man show against the entire New York State establishment. You want to talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that when I talk to young law students today, this is so foreign to them, because when students go to law school now, it's a very individual pursuit. You're going to go to law school, and you might want to do amazing social justice things, but it feels very, I think, isolating and very individual. And, in the 1960s and early 1970s, there was a lot of communal energy behind lawyering. And in this particular case, the National Lawyers Guild was central to this. The National Lawyers Guild had gone down to Mississippi and had participated in Mississippi Summer and had defended people there and in Parchman Prison and so forth. And then in 1970, I'm going to get it wrong, was it 3, I think, 73 or 4, is that me? No, that's not me. Could be. The National Lawyers Guild had their annual convention, and they basically, the president of the Lawyers Guild stood up in front of the room, and they had a big map of the United States, and he drew a big line down the middle of the map, and he said, all of you to the east of the Mississippi, you're going to Attica, and all of you to the west are going to go to Wounded Knee. And there was this understanding that, these people need lawyers, and it's gonna have to be pro bono, and it's gonna, and it doesn't matter whether you have your law degree or not, we need you there to be investigators and stenographers and you know, publicity people. And so it was an incredible grassroots legal defense effort that it changed history. They had all the money, the state of New York had all the money in the prosecution. They had all the investigators, all the money, all the resources at their disposal, and these guys had nothing. And just through sheer volunteerism, they created, but they filed, and they knew the law. So they blizzarded the state of New York with motions. They knew there was selective prosecution going on, so they you know, absolutely just blizzarded the state with the law. And they managed to take 62 prisoners who had been indicted, and ultimately out of that whole batch, many of those cases had to be dismissed by the state. They lost the state lost in every single trial but one. And even the one that they lost, eventually they lost the verdict. So, I mean, that's never happened. The only comparable moment that I can think of is with the trial of the Scottsboro Boys, the legal effort marshaled to defend the Scottsboro Boys. So I think every law student should know that history, because it's about not just lawyering, it's about what does it mean to be a lawyer and have a community behind you that educates the public on what the issues are, and that represents people even if they don't have a dime, right? And it's not in the formal public defender capacity, although many of them were public defenders, but actually in a much more kind of, they all moved in communal houses, like stuff I could never do. And in fact, one of the key lawyers, Ernie Goodman, who was from Detroit, people came from Detroit, they came from Chicago, they came from everywhere. Ernie Goodman, when he came, he defended a prisoner by the name of Shango. He basically says, you all are 10 years younger than me, and you all are living in your houses. I'll be moving into the Statler Hotel in downtown Buffalo. Thank you very much. I will not be smoking joints on your couch tonight while we.
Well, and then those attorneys became attorneys for the plaintiffs in the civil rights
That's
case
exactly
in
right.
federal court, and
That's
they
right.
faced an equal burden
That's right.
in federal court because the federal court judge did not like what they were saying.
That's right.
And the federal
And
court
stalled them,
judge
boy.
really, well, was uneven and unfair in his decisions regarding the plaintiffs' motions.
That's right. And that's the thing about this story, that there are heroes in every group and heroines as much as there are villains. In law enforcement, for example, I mean, I tell you terrible things that troopers did, but if it were not for the conscientious troopers, the prisoners would not have been victorious in their civil suit probably, because it was from the troopers that we learned that when the troopers went in that day, they took off their identifying badges. And that was a key fact in the case, right, to show that this was kind of premeditated reprisals, excessive reprisals. That evidence came from troopers who had been haunted by this since the day it happened. There were deputy sheriffs who came forward. The FBI, the only way the Justice Department knew what was happening, because National Guardsmen who had watched this trauma were going to FBI officials, and there were FBI officials trying to get a federal civil rights case. I mean, clearly it was not going to happen given who was in charge of the FBI, but at the ground level, people understood that this should have been a civil rights case. So in every court, and reporters trying to get the real story told, it's kind of this extraordinary story of like, kind of, I always like to say, who raised you? And some people were raised right and some people weren't in terms of where they stood in that really conflicted moment.
Could you, there in the book, you spent some time on an individual, a lawyer, Harvard lawyer, who found his way working with New York State, specifically with Anthony Simonetti, and he was involved in the investigations that were created by Rockefeller shortly thereafter.
Which one, Whiteman?
Malcolm Bell.
Oh, Bell.
Malcolm Bell.
Yes.
And ultimately, Malcolm Bell was doing a lot of research, and then he became the real story of the whistleblower who disclosed a lot of the cover-up, which is really the bottom story. Do you want to give a little background on Malcolm Bell?
Yeah, everyone should know. I mean, really the hero, the bottom line two heroes in this story are Edlin, the coroner who told the truth, and the other one was Malcolm Bell. Malcolm Bell was an attorney who got a job with the Attica investigation. That was that very corrupted investigation that only ended up indicting prisoners and no members of law enforcement. And he was a pretty politically conservative guy, had no real dog in this fight, but when he was hired, he was told he was going to investigate this case evenly, right? It was going to be even prosecution. And he took that charge seriously. He's a deeply, deeply ethical man, and he basically kept trying to bring troopers to justice because he had the evidence and he knew what the state had. He could see everything the state had. The state knew which troopers had done what, pretty much. Even as corrupted as that investigative file was, there was evidence that could at the very least have indicted troopers on reckless endangerment, which is a felony, and in a couple of key cases actually could have indicted them for murder. And when he tried to do that, he was basically stalled, shut down. And on the eve of Rockefeller's nominating hearings to be vice president of the United States, the entire investigation gets shut down, his. So he becomes a whistleblower. He goes to the New York Times. He tells his story. And he wrote a whistleblowing document that has been under wraps for 45 years that told the truth about what the state knew, when the state knew it, and what it did not do with it. In other words, who it did not prosecute. And this was a very detailed document. It was 167 pages. There were 3 copies of it ever done, because remember, this is before it's easy to make copies of things. And 1 copy went to the Attorney General, 1 went to the governor, who at the time was Hugh Carey, and the 3rd went to, I believe, Simonetti in his own office. That was it. I interviewed Malcolm Bell. This whole thing changed his life. He was drummed out. He was discredited. He was not protected as a whistleblower. And I asked him because I wanted to see that file, or that document. And he, again, so ethical, he would not show it to me because he said, by training, I'm a lawyer. This is a protected document. I can't show it to you. But I just wouldn't give up, and I ended up finding it. In the most incredible moment that will never be repeated in my life. I found that, and I found the confidential document that told me what was happening in the pool house. And that document told me who had done what, and what the state knew, and what it didn't do. And that's also in my book. I actually name who some of the shooters were.
So lawyers, this time again, ethics kind of taking on center stage, Malcolm Bell, doing the right thing and being drummed out, and obviously had an impact, but it did create an environment which ultimately led to, coupled with the fact that Nelson Rockefeller at the time had aspirations, being a president, he was up for the vice presidential hearings, etc. Things were wrapping up, and they tried to, I don't say cover it up, but they kind of cleaned the criminal slates.
They said, we're going to close the books on Attica. We're not going to indict any more inmates. We're going to give clemency to the ones who have been convicted, and we will never prosecute any troopers. It's done. And that was in 1976.
Enter Elizabeth Fink. And for those who are lawyers in the Buffalo area, and I had lots of people call me when they saw it in Buffalo, the Erie Buff Bar Association, that this event was occurring. And all they talked about, I remember being in the courtroom, Elizabeth Fink, Liz Fink, Liz Fink, Liz Fink. And,
so she was a force. And another person who passed away, in her case, literally 3 weeks before my book was out. And so another kind of heartbreaking piece of this story. Big Black also died before my book was done. I mean, all these people that I just so wish that I could have shared the story with. So she was one of these criminal defense lawyers in the very beginning of the story. She had just gotten her law degree and was one of the many of those lawyers who showed up in upstate New York to defend these Attica brothers. And but then years later, when the state said we're going to shut it down, no more, Attica's gone, no more, Big Black said, it's not done, because we were beaten, we were traumatized, I mean, everyone's living with PTSD, people lost their brothers, they lost their son. No, this is not done. And he tried to resurrect the civil suit. It had been filed the same time. 1971, they filed their civil suit, but according to New York State, they couldn't litigate it till the criminal trials were done. Well, by then, you know, people are tired, they've lost momentum, they're exhausted, people have died, people have moved on, but he was determined to resurrect the suit, and he asked Liz to do it, because as he said, nobody was more tenacious. Out of all the boys, she was the most tenacious, and she was a force indeed, and she and Big Black together, along with Joe Heath, and Danny Meyer, and this kind of Michael Deutsch out of Chicago, all litigated the civil case in Buffalo. And here's one quick funny story about that. So it was in Judge Elfin's court, and he was an obstructionist extraordinaire in terms of getting this case to be able to move forward. But there was no stenographer in the courtroom because he had been accused of having an affair with the court reporters, so she was barred from the courtroom. So the entire thing was recorded with tape. It was tape recorded. And you know, so anyway, so to see that theater, it was pure theater. I mean, if no other way to put it. I mean, she was really a force to reckon with.
And I covered the affair.
Yeah, and so you know, you were there.
Tell us more.
And the judge goes to Barbados when the jury's deliberating, and the jury's like, "What?" And he's like, "That's my vacation." And they're like, "This is the most important civil trial in New York history, and you're in Barbados."
But the Second Circuit made him come back.
That's right, and that was Judge Chaleska, and Judge Chaleska basically said, "Get your ass back here." Yeah, that's right.
Elfin, in reading your book, one of the things he did do, he actually certified the group as for class action purposes.
Well, he did and he didn't. He kept changing his mind.
And then he finally recertified at the end. It kind of went back and forth. Liz Fink was able to see virtually any document she needed to see, and once she's seen documents that no one outside the Attica investigation had ever seen, including all 3 volumes of the Paul Webb-inspired Meyer report and countless documents from the state's year-long investigation of prisoner troopers, Fink felt well prepared to litigate, and she did with a vengeance.
Yes, she did.
So I gotta
But
say,
it took them 30 years to litigate that civil case, 29 to be precise. And you should know that 2 almost all-white upstate juries awarded Big Black the upper level of the award of $4 million, and a white prisoner by the name of David Brozig the lower end of the award, which was, I believe, $75,000. Now remember, the class is 1,200 people. It includes people who've been shot down, people who've been tortured, so just do the math. It was an extraordinary verdict. And so it was shut down. And they were told that they were no longer a class, they were going to have to go back to square one and re-litigate each case individually. And they were told this on the eve of these jury verdicts. And so ultimately they settled for $12 million, but the prisoners were awarded 8. And, you know, it may sound like a lot of money, but, you know, a death would get you $6,500. So it was really a what do you call it, a sidestepping of the jury process for sure.
just for the lawyers who will enjoy this story, and you alluded to it, Lee, that in the middle of the extensively drawn-out, attenuated jury began its deliberations and a new drama erupted. Judge Elfin decided to take a vacation during the jury deliberations. Can you give a little more substance? Did you cover that, Lee? Were you part of that?
I didn't cover the trial. I certainly know that he took a vacation. The word on the street was his wife Peg demanded it, so consequently it was scheduled and they had to go. But I did cover his
Dalliance.
yeah, his dalliance with his courtroom stenographer, which was a very, which was. Well, you know, as an assistant United States attorney, I had several cases in front of him, and the best way I could describe him was cantankerous.
He enjoyed it. It was
He
sport.
sure did.
He said, I interviewed him, And he just chuckled. I mean, he just sat back and he chuckled and he said, there was nothing more fun than watching, Liz Fink squirm. Like, he would literally make rulings and decisions because he just loved to watch the frustration and the interplay and the game of it all. And then would make one decision one day and another decision the next day, and there'd be no consistency, and he would just sit back and he delighted in it. There's just no other way to describe it.
So ultimately, he takes off for Barbados. What's happening during this time period? I got to believe Liz Fink is out of control. Here's the plaintiff's attorney saying, "You got to be kidding me! They're out. The jury's deliberating, and you leave.
Well,
what do you put on
the
suspense?"
reason why that was so important, just so that we understand, is that there was a lot of decisions during this trial that the judge had made that were really, really could have been very devastating to the plaintiffs, to the prisoners. For example, not allowing the jury to see that picture I showed you, a big black on the table with the football. Like, not allowing certain evidence to get before the jury. And so the jury they felt, they wanted to know, they wanted to see what everything that was possible. So there was all these decisions that had to be made during deliberations, right? Juries come out and they're like, we need a clarification on this, we'd like to see that. And so he just was AWOL. But it backfired because it infuriated them. And they wrote a long letter to him, basically saying, "You called us in here. We've left our families. We've been in here for weeks. We are doing due diligence. We take our jobs very, very seriously. And you go on vacation, and then you threaten us," because that was the other thing. He had basically threatened them and said, get it done now, or something like that.
And his line was something like, "Well, there's always a telephone."
Yeah.
That he could communicate by telephone to instruct the jury when they wanted a question.
But here's the thing about the criminal trial, though, that I think it goes to the point where we've all been talking about, abuse of power and who's responsible. Ultimately, the verdict, as powerful as it was, it only held one, relatively low figure in all this, which was the deputy commissioner, or the deputy superintendent of the prison, liable. And who was in the suit originally was Rockefeller and Monahan, who was the head of state police, and Oswald, the commissioner of corrections. All of the cast of characters from the top, from the governor's office to the people on the ground who watched the beatings happen and didn't do anything. They were all defendants. And because this case had taken so long, many of them were not served in time. The Rockefeller gets out of it because of executive immunity. And so at the end of the day, the only people, and Oswald by then had died, it had taken so long, and Monahan eventually dies, and all that's left standing is this one deputy superintendent, and he was he should have been held responsible. He watched as these reprisals went on. He allowed them to happen. He allowed the torture to happen. But can you imagine, like, it all ends up on the one deputy superintendent of the prison? I mean, who never decided any of this, undoubtedly. So that's the icky part of all this, I think.
But with that one conviction against a state official, that opened up the door to the damages part, which ultimately made the state exposed, and then got into whole Judge Teleska, and I won't get into that, but it's a fascinating, long, wonderful, talk about acting like King Solomon, just to sort that whole out among the various potential plaintiffs. Judge Teleska did a magnificent job, and I commend you to get the book. If you don't have it, see Mary downstairs, because the memo in it by Sam Williams does a great job of identifying this. Gary, you've listened to some of this play out, which is the history aspect of it. What, from the FBI's perspective, the Department of Justice's perspective, who you report to, the U.S. Attorney, how do you see the legacy of that Attica? A lot went on during that time period. A lot, you talked a little bit about the observation of it that your bureau may have now implemented or seen implemented or learned from. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Sure, a lot of lessons learned, and I touched on some of them. Today, there would have been, like I said, not to repeat myself, but negotiating.
Key.
Hopefully would have kept on going. I don't want to Monday morning quarterback what happened, But today, it's relied upon heavily. We've seen that in some of the long standoffs that we've participated in ourselves. They go on a long, long time, some of them. There's a reason for that. You're talking, and meeting demands, and it's just key to what we do now. It's not all about the tactics. It's about the talking. The other thing I'd like to say is I've never worked civil rights, but I've worked drug trafficking primarily throughout my career, so I've talked with a number of inmates. I've supervised a criminal squad in Jacksonville, Florida, and I've received hundreds of letters from inmates alleging a lot of things, and we followed up on a lot of them. What makes this difficult is sorting through the letters that are just false, misleading. And what's extraordinarily frustrating about that is there are people that probably need our help, and that's never going to change. It kind of is what it is. But I wanted to make mention of that. We have all across this land, we have strong relationships with the states that have Office of Inspector Generals looking at their prisons, a separate entity. We rely on them heavily. We work hand in hand with them heavily. And so I wanted to make mention of that as well.
And Heather pointed out, that there are problems still existing, but some things did change in Attica. After the riot and the aftermath, number one now, corrections officers have to be trained. Before, they just went into the prison and they learned from the people who had been there. Now they have to go through training. Now the state has emergency response teams that are specially trained in case something develops in a prison, and they're skilled in negotiation and going in and trying to calm things down. And the state is also in various prisons set up a grievance procedure. Now, I don't know how effective it is, but at least the prisoners can now vent their grievances to some administrator within the prison, and supposedly each grievance is answered. So, and obviously the medical treatment improved a bit, and I think the state recognized the different dietary restrictions and needs of prisoners, and that has changed. So some things did change in the prison system because of Attica. Believe me, not enough, but at least some things.
I'm so glad you said that, Lee, and I think that in this point about learning about negotiation and learning about to not necessarily dismiss the word of someone inside, those are important lessons learned, and that's actually why I begin my talk with the kind of data on how big our prison system is right now, because these things are related. It isn't that we, let me put it to you this way. We improve the techniques and we improve the ability to do justice better, but when you have a system that is this enormous and takes this level of resources and has this many people in it, it becomes an unmanageable behemoth. You get hundreds of letters a day. I mean, I get hundreds of letters a day. It's hard to, not a day, a week. It's hard to sort through it all because you're talking about a system. If we went back simply to the number of people who were incarcerated when Attica erupted, we would have to let out, what, 1.5 million people? I mean, just tomorrow, we'd have to open the doors, 1.5 million people walk home. So you're talking about a scale now that it's gonna undermine medical care. It's gonna undermine negotiation. It's gonna undermine the ability for human beings to be heard when they're in trauma. It's gonna undermine the ability of parents to see children or, people to integrate back in the community. This is a behemoth, and that's why the policy piece of this, we always just need to keep it alive. What we're voting for. We always are voting for more prison construction, more dollars for more prisons when it is broken and there's not one person that advocates for it as effective. And so it's kind of, people say, well, then what can we do differently? And I think that's where I think that we just need to read more, learn more, pay attention more, because we didn't used to do it that way. Actually, crime is not higher now than it ever was. And so therefore, we can do this differently. And then those new rules and those new things we've learned and those abilities to respond could actually be effective, because we wouldn't be dealing with what is really a crisis situation of incarceration right now.
I think one other advantage in terms of checking power is technology. You didn't have that in 1971 when you were at Attica.
That's right.
Now, my smartphone, every text I send, we get FOIA requests by the thousands per week. You'll see that I have to pick up a gallon of milk on the way home, by the way, in a text message if you FOIA my phone today. But all kidding aside, every email, every text message, it's transparency. It's all about transparency. You didn't have that advantage back then. Boy, you sure have it now.
And the prisoners have cell phones. Not in every state, but in Lee, South Carolina right now, I mean, that's one of the controversies. The docs people will tell you that that's the reason why there is conflict in the prison. That's the reason why there is violence. I mean, I've really looked at this. I mean, yes, anytime you have any kind of contraband in prisons, there's going to be a level of violence, but so then sell them from the commissary. I mean, that's the real threat of the cell phone in a prison, is that they document what's going on. So, for example, the Department of Corrections was saying that the reason why there was nobody coming in to deal with the conflict there that day when 7 prisoners died was that it was too chaotic. It was not safe for law enforcement to go in. They didn't go in for 7 hours. Well, guess what? There's a lot of them that are filming what's actually happening. And what you see is that the tier is stone silent. People are bleeding out after this fight has happened. Prisoners are helping other prisoners. You can hear them saying, you know, we keep calling for the police. They're not showing up. Where are the police? Where are the doctors? And so when Brian Sterling, who's Department of Corrections official, is going on the news and saying this place was, you know, chaotic and we couldn't go in, it's just a bald-faced lie. But you gotta believe the people who were, you know. So technology is also a way for us to see what is actually happening inside. The response was not to fix what was going on inside, it's to spend even more money and bring cell phone jammers to the South Carolina prison system. That's the response. And so this is why, like, again, this is about a policy question more than anything else, because we just keep doubling down on a policy that doesn't work.
Well, I'm going to continue this conversation, but Mary, would you be willing to come down for just a few minutes? I'd love to put a face to a name who actually was. By the way, she is the biggest deal at the Robert H. Jackson Federal Courthouse. I had to get that in. Mary, why don't you sit here? Sit here. And I'll just lead you into this. She is the courtroom deputy. What's your official title there?
I'm a courtroom deputy to Judge Scrutiny. That's what I am. You can tell me, you can say something else.
She runs Judge Scrutiny. Well, we were talking earlier, you were taking a quick tour of the Jackson Center, and you mentioned that you had a personal touch to this subject. So could you explain it?
Yes. I can remember vividly the finding out that the prison had been taken over by prisoners or inmates. I was cleaning my room, and my brother came in with the newspaper, the Buffalo Evening News. That's how we found out. Sure, I tell everybody in court to do that. Obviously, I don't pay attention. Well, have you ever known for me to need a microphone?
No.
I didn't think so. Okay, my brother came in with the newspaper. We found out that the prison was under hostage situation. My uncle was one of the hostages. For me, it was 11 years old. I had one uncle. My dad had one sister. That was her husband. I mean, I lived in Elma, in the country. We didn't, I knew nothing about the prison. All I knew was on Christmas, on Easter, any holiday, that the cons were usually eating better than we were. That's what I was told. That's all I knew. I knew nothing else. to read this book, to find out what actually happened, is horrific. It is unbelievable that that could happen during my lifetime. I've been to Auschwitz, I've been to Dachau, the concentration camps, and I found it unbelievable that that could happen to my parents and my grandparents. I feel this is just as bad. My parents, it's the first time. My dad went immediately to Attica. My aunt, my mom, left us, first time she left us alone. I had 2 younger brothers and 1 older brother. I felt I was a hostage because he was in charge. The prison was stormed, the day the prison was stormed was September 13th. That was my 12th birthday. That's part of what I remember. Didn't know what was happening. They were talking about it in school, had no idea what was going on until I got on the school bus, and my brother had a transistor radio, and he told me that the prison had been stormed. Unbeknownst to me, the school had been called and told, but the school never told us that my uncle was survived. My uncle was this great, fun-loving guy. From that day on, that was not the same. He ended up taking the leave of absence because they said, oh, everything's all right, you get a $51 check. My aunt, at the time of the prison, when it was taken over, she was a 4th grade teacher in the Attica school system. The school was on lockdown. She didn't know what was going on. Her husband, she knew, had gone to work that day. Wasn't supposed to work, but he went to work because they thought something was going on because of the conditions in the prison. She had to control a classroom of 4th graders, not knowing whether her husband was dead or alive. He did, like I said, he just was not the same. He ended up, there was some other personal tragedies in the family. He ended up having a heart attack, and he died. My aunt is bitter, was very bitter over it. I think she's still bitter over this settlement because it was too little, too late. It was too little, too late, okay? And you can't, it's part of the settlement. I commend Judge Teleska for listening to the prisoners because from sitting into court and just letting them tell their story, because that's what Judge Scrutiny does. Sometimes all they want to do, all the defendants want to do, all the inmates that have grievances that are bringing federal court cases, all they want to do is tell their story. They want to listen. They want someone to listen to it. And I think Judge Scrutiny does that. Judge Teleska did it. I think he tried to do that with the families when they brought their forgotten victims suit. Because since my brother did uncover my aunt's testimony, and I've read that. It was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking. I mean, that was not my immediate family, but we experienced it. We experienced it. So, I mean, I thank you for bringing this book to light. It took me a long time to read it, a long time to read it. In '81, I was getting my bachelor's from Buff State in criminal justice, and I sat in a prisoner reform class, scared to death. I was the only white female in a classroom of minorities. Little did I know what they were saying was true. I didn't know that because I just heard, what I saw on the news, okay? A lot of things that came out after, we just stayed away from because it was, it brought tragedy and it was painful. Even though I was out here and, I wasn't part of that, like, immediate nucleus. And now, looking back, I'm like, wow. And then, fast forward to the 90s. I've been working for Judge Scrutiny since 1990. We were kind of out across the street. We weren't in the physical courthouse. So the Judge Elfin stuff was going on over here, and we were over there. But I'm now a personal friend of the ACRO that took down the right, when you have, he didn't have the court reporter, wasn't allowed the court reporter, but they had to hire what's called an ACRO. So everything's taped, but in order for, in case it has to be transcribed in the future, she needs to write down who's speaking and basically what they're saying, so that on different tracks on the tape, so that they know if it's transcribed, the person that's transcribing it knows who's speaking. So she lived the Elfin part of it. I'm horrified by some of the things Judge Elfin did. Okay, we just got a little piece of it. Wouldn't happen in Judge Scrutiny courtroom. It'll never happen in Judge Scrutiny courtroom. And I'm just like blown away by the book.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you.
You kidding me? You run the court. Can you go? You can do
Well,
what you
can
want.
I tell you one quick funny story? I never knew. I didn't watch much news when I was a kid. The first time I met Lee Coppola, I locked him out of the courtroom. And he said to me, "You can't do that. Do you know who I am?" I'm like, "No."
Thank you, Mary, for doing that. She was a reluctant soldier, too.
But you know, thank you, Mary, as well, for sharing that. And one of the reasons I'm so grateful for you sharing that is that the thing about this book that I take zero credit for is that the stories that people told me, the ability that people let me into their lives in a way that was so humbling. And there were so many points. I mean, I'm the mother of 3 children myself. I have a family that has, my grandfather was an FBI agent, but I also have an uncle who did federal time. I mean, I felt very much like in the middle of all of these stories and so unable to feel that if I put them on the page, it would really do them justice. Like that it could really convey every reader what people like you had experienced. And I don't know whether I did that, but to the extent that I did, it was because people told me stories like you did, which was the kind of, it wasn't the history, it was the impact of the history. It was, what it felt like to be, in school in the Attica school district when this was going on, what it felt like to be, to literally have a husband inside and nobody is telling you what's going on. You don't know whether they're a hostage, you don't know whether they're on guard, you don't know whether they're dead, you don't know whether they're alive. And one of the hostages, actually the widow had been told he was alive. And she goes to the hospital thinking she's going to bring him home, but it turns out he's actually not alive. I mean, just, there were suicides in the families of Attica victims, and that's just the hostage side. That's just the state employee side of it. And then, of course, that same trauma that plays out in the prisoner side. And so that's the story. I mean, the story is that when you tell lies and when you make cavalier decisions about how to handle something like criminal justice, it isn't just that, it's a news bang and flash, and it ripples and it goes on. And when I first met people, I'm a historian. You go, I'll tell you what happened. Give me the research, I'll tell you what happened. And I just would seriously sit there time and again and just like be in tears. Like, I don't know how you can record this. And so that's another reason it took so long, because it was, how do you do it? Like, adjectives are so lame, terrible, horrific, traumatic, right? Like, how do you actually make language convey what you just conveyed? So thank you.
We're going to kind of wrap up here, but I want to give Gary, you drove down with Maureen Dempsey right here, who really runs the FBI office.
You got that right.
There are, as Mary runs Judge Scrutiny's office, there's Maureen Dempsey. You
got that right.
So as you're driving down today, and probably talked a little bit about the book of Heather Ann Thompson, what did you talk about? What was kind of the points that we probably haven't brought up yet?
That history matters. Director Free mandated several years ago that every recruit class out of Quantico, Virginia, go through the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And when asked, why are we doing this? We're there to train agents to gather facts, tactical training, teach them to drive. Some still can't. But his response was, the Holocaust happened because not enough good people stood up. And when good people don't stand up, bad things happen. And this is a reminder, history tends to repeat itself, and that's why we're going to do it. History does matter, and history does repeat itself. And excellent job on the book. And I grew up here, and I was pretty young, obviously, but you know, we learned about it in school. Had no idea. I had no idea the depth of what went on. But thank you for writing it.
Glad you mentioned the Holocaust, because around this room here at the Robert Jackson Center, the first person to actually prosecute
Yep.
that thing called the Holocaust was Robert Jackson, whose
Yep.
name is on the federal courthouse. And we were talking about the book and Lee Capolo. I'm glad we did not lock you out, because I recognize that that would be a serious mistake, Mary. Nice job. But you had a chance to actually review this book.
I did.
And you want to comment on that review? And Heather's just an arm's length away.
It's all good.
Well, actually, when I was given the book, you know, I told the book editor, I said, you know, I was there that day, and he said, yeah, I know, that's why you're reviewing the book. And so I read it with fascination, because many of the scenes that Heather portrayed, especially in part one, I lived. The second part I watched, and the third part I really appreciated because of the story she told about the people. My first impression was, so what? It was 45 years ago. You know, so much has been done about Attica. And I think my review started out something like, how many trees have been felled so we can write about Attica? And I went through what she did through the book, and basically I ended it by saying, so was it worth it? Was it necessary? And the answer was, of course, yes, because of exactly what she showed in the book that no one really had done before and put together. I mean, you could assume things from newspaper stories and magazine stories, but what Heather did was make history come alive and make it effective and show how history is. We say here, you don't want it to repeat itself. So I appreciated that as a book reviewer. She's a pretty damn good writer, too.
So you win the Pulitzer Prize. I mean, you were musing about whether or not you could articulate the story after 13 years. On the book, there it is, Pulitzer Prize winner of 2017. How does that happen? How did you notify? How were you notified of that? We don't get a chance to talk to anybody who really gets that award.
Well, I can tell you a couple of things. First of all, when the book came out, I quite literally wasn't sure that anyone would read it, both because it was too long and also because it was a grim subject matter, and finally because nobody really wants to know what happens in prison. So the fact that anyone even read it at all was the first surprise to me. And then it started to get, in the first week, I think it was reviewed like 4 different places in the New York Times. And I just was like watching in amazement that people were interested in the story. So then when readers started reading it, and it ended up getting quite a few awards. This was all before the Pulitzer. Every time it happened, I just kept being kind of startled by it and so grateful, because again, the people in the story, particularly the hostage families and particularly the prisoners and their families, they had been trying to tell this story for 45 years. And so for me, it was like, wow, they're listening to your story, right? Someone's listening. And when I didn't really know much about the Pulitzer. I didn't know that. Well, first of all, I'd never dreamed about it. Never could even imagine. And so much so that I didn't even know that it was being announced. So I was teaching. I was teaching a history class, and my students that were in that class this day, some of them have actually subsequently written me that this was like such a great moment in their lives, because I'm teaching, my phone is ringing like nonstop, and I'm ignoring it because I'm not going to be teaching and answer my phone, and I see that it's my agent calling, and I'm like, why is she calling me? Because, it's not whatever. She would email me. Nothing is so important. And by the third call, I said, excuse me, to my class, and I walked out in the hallway, and I picked it up, and I said, Jerry, like, what's going on? And she is in tears. So I think that something terrible's happened, but I can't put it together. Like, if it was my family that something terrible happened to, why would my agent be calling me? I couldn't figure it out. And she says, you just won the Pulitzer Prize. And I just was, what? What? Like, they just cannot be. And I was so flabbergasted that I ran down the hall where my husband was teaching, and I told him, and then I said, but I'm teaching. I got to go run back to my class. And then I said, but wait a minute, I can't go in my class. My students are running. What is going on? And so I called my undergraduate thesis advisor, who was still teaching at Michigan, And I left him a message. He was the first person I wanted to call. And I said, Terry, I said, I can't believe this, but I actually just won the Pulitzer Prize. And he was the first person that told me I could be a historian, that I could actually do this. And so I left him a message, and I went back to my classroom, and I said to my students, we've just won the Pulitzer Prize. And so they all just start clapping, and they all start calling their mothers in my classroom, and that's literally what happened.
Wow.
And the thing of it was that honestly, it sounds so strange, but I was so overcome because one thing I knew was I knew that meant that at least it had put a stamp of something on their story. And I cannot express enough to you how many times when the hostages would tell their trauma, people were like, yeah, come on, couldn't be that bad. Or when the prisoners would talk about the abuse they'd suffered, everybody said, didn't happen. Worst thing that ever happened in Attica was a fraternity hazing. That's straight out of the court documents. And just that gave it that said that what's in here is true. And that was everything to me.
Wow. You pulled up a picture here, Lee.
I just wanted to show Heather, I'm in her book.
Yeah. With the doctor, that's right.
That's the only guy coming out of the prison.
That's right. That's right.
Due to some technical difficulty, we also had a picture of Lee. We're going to put up there. That
great.
picture?
That was in Time magazine.
Yeah, well, there you go.
With that medic that came
I
out.
know.
So buy the book and get Lee to sign it. That's what you
Absolutely.
Yeah, look at how young I am.
So
That happens to us all.
I just want to make a comment to the three of you that I'm looking out here to this crowd of assembled. There are lawyers, there's the public, there's the whole everybody from various municipal officials, et cetera. You know, we've just gone for an hour and 40 minutes, and not one has moved. You realize how difficult that is for especially professionals not to pull out this, among other things, and that's a credit to the three of you. So to Gary Leffert, to Heather Ann Thompson, to Lee Coppola, Mary, thank you for sharing your story. Thank you, one and all. Well, we're not done. There's food downstairs. It's a lunch, and we're going to be joined by Buffalo Sabres Hall of Famer Don Luce. And we got some cloak and dagger stuff to talk with Don Luce about. I can't tell you. You'll have to show up. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so
Well done.
much. Thank you
Well
so
done.
much for coming.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I am so honored to meet you.
Oh, I'm honored to meet you.
This is really
I think that
great.
was a great job.